What if one quiet morning during breakfast, your whole life shattered? What if love turned into betrayal right before your very eyes? I know you are curious. Because who would not be? Stay with me, my friend. This story is going to grab your soul and not let go. The night was still clinging stubbornly to the jagged edges of Manhattan's skyline when Ambrose Blackwell, a man whose very name commanded absolute respect in the cutthroat world of real estate, slipped quietly into his sprawling penthouse. The city glittered beneath him, 1,000 distant lights echoing the glamour and excess of the life he had built. But inside his home, the air was heavy, waiting, still, and significantly colder. Then he realized his expensive tuxedo jacket reeked faintly of a sweet, musky perfume that certainly was not his wife's, and the faint, careless lipstick smudge on his collar told a sordid story he arrogantly believed he had hidden. Well, to Ambrose, the night had been a massive triumph. It was a high society gala, rubbing elbows with billionaire investors, a champagne-soaked celebration of his own ego and the intoxicating, reckless company of his mistress. He truly thought he was untouchable, a golden king sitting comfortably at the absolute height of his reign. What he did not know, and what his blinding pride prevented him from seeing, was that his meticulously constructed empire was about to tremble. It would not crumble from a crash in the stock market or a bad business deal, but from the fragile, shaking hands of the woman he had once solemnly vowed to love and protect. In the massive gourmet kitchen, the soft golden glow of the early morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows and illuminating Jacqueline Blackwell's trembling fingers as they rested gently on a thick stack of legal papers. She was 6 months pregnant. Her swollen belly was a quiet, profound testament to promises that had been brutally broken, pointing to a future that suddenly seemed terrifyingly uncertain. She had waited up all night, sleepless and hollow-eyed, pacing the cold marble floors. She tortured herself by replaying every whispered societal rumor, every unexplained late-night absence, and every lingering trace of foreign perfume that clung to her husband's tailored clothes. Tonight, the agonizing truth had finally become unbearable and completely undeniable. She had heard the whispers from so-called friends. She had seen the cruel, dismissive apathy in his eyes for months. But last night, when Ambrose did not return home at all, when the vast city simply swallowed him whole into its neon maw, Jacqueline finally accepted the grim reality of her existence. She was no longer the cherished wife of his heart. She was only the silent, convenient keeper of his public image. Her pulse thundered in her ears like a drum as she set the crisp papers down at his usual seat at the breakfast table. This was not a sweet love note. It was not a gentle, tearful plea for him to change his ways. They were divorce papers, heavy pages that carried the immense, crushing weight of her broken trust, the future of her unborn child, and the last remnants of her bleeding dignity. She was not the naive, starry-eyed girl from upstate New York anymore. The one who had foolishly believed in happily ever after fairy tales. She was a woman, scorned, pushed to the absolute brink, and though her physical body was exhausted, her spirit was ablaze with a single, unwavering decision. She would not be silent anymore. She would not be humiliated in front of the world. And she absolutely would not raise her precious child in the dark, toxic shadow of his betrayal. The antique penthouse clock ticked louder than usual, each rhythmic second pulling her closer and closer to the inevitable, explosive confrontation. As she waited, she thought of the young girl she used to be, the girl who had met Ambrose at a glittering, chaotic charity gala during her college years. Completely dazzled by his magnetic confidence and boundless promise. That young girl had genuinely believed his ruthless ambition was somehow romantic. That girl had eagerly followed him into tense boardrooms, into exhausting late-night strategy sessions, and into financial dreams so massive they swallowed their nights whole. That girl had willingly sacrificed her own identity and career to support him, to be the calm, unwavering anchor in his chaotic storm of ambition. And yet, where had all that loyalty brought her? It had brought her to this very morning, pregnant, emotionally abandoned, and preparing to hand her husband the legal papers that would violently rip their world apart. Ambrose, careless and completely wrapped in his own arrogance, hummed a cheerful tune to himself as he casually loosened his silk tie, striding confidently toward the kitchen without even noticing the thick, suffocating stillness that hung in the air. To him, it was just another triumphant morning after another successful conquest. He fully expected Jacqueline to greet him softly, to set a warm breakfast in front of him, to smile and pretend nothing was wrong. Just exactly as she always had done. Because of his narcissism, he did not see the cold steel forming in her eyes, nor did he sense the quiet, dangerous fire that had been building inside her breaking heart, waiting patiently for this exact moment. When he swaggered into the kitchen, he suddenly froze. The sight before him was so ordinary, yet it startled him to his core. Jacqueline was sitting perfectly upright at the table, her face incredibly pale but terrifyingly composed. The thick stack of divorce papers neatly placed right before her. For the first time in years, Ambrose actually felt the earth shift violently beneath his expensive leather shoes. She was not weeping. She was not shouting or throwing things. She was not begging for his affection. She was eerily silent, rock steady, and stronger than he had ever remembered her being. The air between them was sharp, enough to cut glass. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice was trembling, not with weakness or fear, but with an intense, restrained fury that she was fighting to keep entirely under control. "I thought you would like something different for breakfast today." With a smooth, Deliberate motion. Her hand slid the heavy stack of papers across the polished mahogany table toward him. Ambrose blinked rapidly, uncomprehending. At first. Divorce papers? Here. In his ultimate sanctuary? He forced a familiar, arrogant smirk onto his face. The exact kind of charming, manipulative smile that had successfully charmed callous investors and entirely disarmed his fiercest business rivals. Jacqueline, darling, what is this? Some kind of dramatic gesture? His carefully chosen words dripped with heavy condescension. But even as he forcefully spoke them, a strange, unfamiliar tightness gripped his chest. He recognized the chilling, absolute calm in her eyes. It was the terrifying calm of someone who had already let go of him completely. Jacqueline's delicate fingers brushed gently against the curve of her swollen belly, her piercing gaze never once leaving his face. It is not a gesture, Ambrose. It is the truth. You broke every single promise you ever made to me. You broke me. And now, I absolutely will not let you break our child. 2. Her steady voice finally cracked just a fraction at the word child. For a fleeting, almost microscopic second, Ambrose did not see the fierce, defensive woman challenging him. He saw the beautiful, hopeful woman who had once stood radiantly beside him at the Plaza Hotel, dressed in stunning white, her trembling hand tightly clasping his as they joyfully vowed to be together forever. But that brief, inconvenient memory dissolved quickly, swallowed whole by the massive, ugly weight of his ongoing betrayal and his towering ego. The suffocating silence grew unbearable. Outside the thick glass windows, the massive city roared with its usual chaotic morning energy. Taxis were honking aggressively, sirens were wailing in the distance, and million-dollar deals were being struck on the streets below. But inside the luxurious penthouse, time seemed completely suspended. Ambrose slowly picked up the crisp papers with hands that had suddenly begun to tremble, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking. He opened his mouth and tried to speak, to spin a web of lies, as he always did, but the words became stuck dryly in his throat. For the very first time in his meticulously, carefully orchestrated life, the great Ambrose Blackwell did not know what to say. He simply did not know how to control this narrative. Jacqueline rose slowly, planting her hands and steadying herself gracefully against the edge of the table. She was not going to stand there and argue with a wall. She was not going to lower herself to beg for his decency. She was simply going to leave him sitting there alone with the cold, hard truth. Her pale lips trembled slightly as she leaned forward and whispered, "You wanted a mistress? Fine, Ambrose. You can have her. But you will never, ever have me again." And with those final, crushing words, she turned deliberately toward the long hallway, her bare feet making soft, quiet sounds against the freezing marble floors. Ambrose's voice finally broke through the heavy silence. sounding raw, desperate, and genuinely panicked. Jacqueline, wait. But she did not stop walking. She did not even turn her head to look back. Because she already knew a profound secret that he had not yet realized. The exact moment she handed him those papers, the real story of their lives had only just begun. And as the heavy oak bedroom door closed firmly behind her, Ambrose Blackwell finally understood for the very first time that his greatest, most terrifying battle was not going to be fought in corporate boardrooms or over billion-dollar real estate deals. It was going to be fought over what happened in that kitchen that morning with the extraordinary wife he had just stupidly lost forever. Jacqueline Mitchell Blackwell had never been the type of woman people realistically expected to end up featured in the glossy, superficial pages of high-end fashion magazines or the vicious gossip columns of Manhattan high society. She was not born into immense wealth. She was not raised with silver spoons in her mouth or sent on lavish weekend shopping trips to Paris. She came from a very quiet, working-class town in upstate New York, a place where a good life was measured by the success of community fundraisers, Sunday church, picnics, and the comforting, steady rhythm of small-town traditions. Her hard-working father had put in incredibly long, grueling hours managing a local hardware store, his tired hands permanently rough and calloused from years of relentless manual labor. Her mother was a dedicated public school teacher, infinitely patient and deeply devoted to her students, teaching them so much more than just simple math or basic reading. She taught them core values, the importance of honesty, the nobility of sacrifice, and the absolute necessity of compassion. From a very young age, Jacqueline naturally stood out from the crowd, not because of family money or social status, but because of her fierce, burning ambition. While many of her peers were perfectly content settling into the narrow, familiar world of their sleepy hometown, she constantly dreamed of towering city skylines and incredible opportunities that were so much bigger than herself. She was the kind of girl who enthusiastically volunteered at every single local charity event, who stayed up incredibly late studying by the dim light of a desk lamp, and who fundamentally believed that if you just worked hard enough and stayed true to yourself, you could eventually reach the stars. Her ultimate dream was beautifully simple yet profoundly powerful: to actually make a positive difference, to truly matter in a vast world that far too often ignored and marginalized women who looked and sounded like her. Through sheer grit, she miraculously won a full academic scholarship to a prestigious Ivy League university. It was a miracle in itself, a golden ticket out of her small town. Stepping off the train and into the loud, chaotic heart of New York City for the very first time, she felt simultaneously terrified and more alive than she had ever been. The concrete streets practically roared with ambition, filled to the brim with people who walked fast and talked even faster, with life-changing opportunities hidden secretly around every single corner. Jacqueline immediately threw herself completely into her demanding studies, absolutely determined not to waste a single second of the incredible gift she had been given. She studied complex economics, eagerly volunteered at high-profile city charity events, and somehow managed to expertly balance 3 different part-time jobs just to cover the basic living expenses that her generous scholarship simply did not. Life was endlessly exhausting, but she pushed through the fatigue because every single step brought her closer to the remarkable woman she desperately wanted to become. It was specifically at one of those glittering charity galas during the winter of her junior year that her path unexpectedly crossed with Ambrose Blackwell. She had been working the wealthy event, wearing a simple uniform and serving expensive hors d'oeuvres on silver platters to billionaire donors. He was already rapidly making a massive name for himself in the city, operating as an incredibly ambitious and ruthless entrepreneur, aggressively carving out a massive slice of Manhattan real estate with his undeniably lethal charm. She actually noticed him long before he ever noticed her. He was tall, wildly confident, and laughing easily and loudly among powerful men who were twice his age. He simply looked like someone who was fundamentally born to win at life. When their eyes finally met across the crowded, sparkling ballroom, something deep inside Jacqueline shifted inexplicably. Ambrose confidently walked over and introduced himself with the smooth, practiced polish of a man who fully knew his own power. But surprisingly, instead of brushing her off as just another invisible student worker passing out food, he paused and genuinely asked her about her rigorous studies and her grand ambitions. She vividly remembered being completely surprised by how intently and quietly he listened to her speak. How warmly he laughed at her nervous, fumbling jokes, and how his dark gaze lingered on her face just a little bit too long. For Jacqueline, a girl who had never truly believed herself to be particularly glamorous or worldly, his undivided attention was highly intoxicating. For once in her life in this massive city, she felt completely seen. She was not looking at herself as the poor scholarship girl, nor as the exhausted waitress precariously balancing heavy plates, but as a fascinating woman with brilliant dreams that were actually worth listening to. Their subsequent courtship was an absolute, dizzying whirlwind. There were incredibly romantic candlelit dinners on expensive yachts cruising the Hudson River, quiet, late-night walks through the snow in Central Park, and luxurious, lazy weekends spent in massive Hamptons estates that he casually borrowed from his wealthy business partners. Jacqueline was rapidly swept away into a glittering, exclusive world she had previously only glimpsed from a very far distance. And truthfully, though there were numerous glaring warning signs, his dark obsession with always winning at any cost, the highly annoying way his cell phone never stopped buzzing even during dinner, the occasional cutting sharpness in his tone whenever she dared to question his methods, she deliberately chose to ignore them all. She naively told herself that this was exactly what raw ambition looked like. She believed this was simply what it took to succeed at the highest levels. And Ambrose, with his seemingly endless, magnetic confidence, made her feel like she truly, deeply belonged in that glittering, exclusive world beside him. By the time she proudly graduated with honors, she was no longer just Ambrose's pretty girlfriend. She operated essentially as his silent business partner. She spent countless hours helping him draft complex business proposals, patiently listened to his deepest financial anxieties, and joyously celebrated his every victory as if it were her own. When he finally proposed to her in the opulent lobby of the Plaza Hotel, getting down on one knee in front of 100 flashing paparazzi cameras, she joyfully said yes without a single second of hesitation. Their lavish wedding was extensively covered in high-end lifestyle magazines, complete with beautiful spreads of Jacqueline posing in a stunning custom-made designer gown, and Ambrose smiling broadly into the camera like a victorious man who had finally conquered both love and empire. But the sad, unspoken truth behind the glossy photographs was that Jacqueline had also made massive, life-altering sacrifices. They were entirely silent ones. The painful kind of sacrifices that brilliant women far too often make in the holy name of love. She quietly turned down an incredible, high-paying job offer at a highly prestigious global nonprofit organization just to focus entirely on maintaining their new marriage. She dutifully learned how to properly move and converse in his elite world, how to flawlessly host massive, catered dinners for critical investors, and how to smile politely and blankly at cruel society women who looked at her with pure disdain, as if she were a peasant who simply did not belong. She constantly convinced herself that this arrangement was only temporary, that her own grand dreams could wait a little longer, and that building Ambrose's massive empire together was somehow enough to fill her soul. Years quickly passed. His immense wealth grew exponentially. His name slowly became entirely synonymous with absolute power in New York. And Jacqueline sadly learned how to live quietly and comfortably in the dark, cold shadows of his towering ambition. Yet, despite the cold environment, she never lost her innate beautiful softness. She still regularly volunteered at local shelters, still fundamentally believed in the immense power of small, daily kindnesses. She still possessed a rare, wonderful way of making the people around her feel deeply seen and valued, even when she herself felt utterly invisible in her own home. But gradually, behind heavily closed doors, deep cracks began to form in the foundation of their marriage. Ambrose began staying out much later into the night, his flimsy explanations growing thinner and more insulting, and his once charming temper turning significantly sharper. And Jacqueline, once so fiercely confident in her own intrinsic worth, tragically began to question whether she actually mattered to him at all anymore. When she finally found out she was pregnant, her heavy heart swelled with an enormous, desperate hope. She truly thought that maybe, just maybe, this tiny, new life would magically bring them closer together again. She prayed that maybe Ambrose would finally slow his frantic pace down. Look at her, and remember the deep, passionate love that had once firmly bound them together. For a very brief, beautiful moment, it actually seemed to be true. He tenderly kissed her. Growing belly, whispered grand promises of being the absolute best father in the world, and tearfully told her that they were finally entering a wonderful new chapter of their lives. Jacqueline desperately believed him because she so deeply wanted to, because love, even when it is severely bruised and beaten, stubbornly clings to any shred of hope. But the cold reality of their situation was far harsher than her dreams. As her belly continued to grow, so did his emotional and physical distance. As she spent endless nights entirely alone, quietly folding tiny, soft baby clothes and happily imagining a beautiful nursery, Ambrose spent his nights living lavishly in expensive hotel suites, attending exclusive galas, or tangled in the eager arms of another woman. Jacqueline profoundly felt this agonizing shift like a dull, rusty knife twisting in her gut. She noticed the subtle way he completely stopped touching her affectionately, the dismissive way his eyes constantly drifted elsewhere when she spoke, and eventually, the sickening, faint smell of cheap perfume lingering on his expensive tailored suits. Each small, seemingly insignificant betrayal cut her significantly deeper than the last, until she reached a breaking point where she could no longer blindly ignore what was happening right in front of her face. And yet, even in the depths of her profound pain, Jacqueline desperately held on to her core dignity. She was absolutely not the type of woman to scream hysterically in public or to hurl wild accusations in front of the staff. She endured the agony quietly, silently bearing the weight of his sins for the sake of the innocent child she currently carried. But deep down in her soul, something soft inside her was rapidly hardening into unbreakable diamond. She vividly remembered her wise mother's parting words before she left for the city. Never let anyone else decide your worth, Jacqueline. Not even the man you love. That fateful morning at the breakfast table, when she bravely slid those divorce papers across the cold marble, it was not merely an impulsive act of blind anger. It was the heavy, inevitable culmination of years of massive sacrifice, of thousands of swallowed tears, of constantly choosing suffocating silence over necessary confrontation. Jacqueline had finally, definitively chosen herself. She had finally chosen to protect her unborn child. What Ambrose completely failed to understand, what no one in their elite circle knew, was that Jacqueline Blackwell was currently stronger than she had ever been in her entire life. She was no longer just a pathetic, scorned wife crying in the dark. She was a fierce, determined mother protecting her young. And this morning was only the very beginning of her spectacular transformation. Because beneath her immense grief, Jacqueline secretly carried a massive arsenal of knowledge that would soon turn Ambrose's precious empire completely upside down. He would very soon learn in the hardest way possible, that betraying the woman who built him was the single most disastrous and costly mistake of his miserable life. The sprawling Blackwell penthouse was far more than just a home. It was a towering, glittering symbol of dominance perched high above the chaos of Midtown Manhattan. Its massive, custom-built glass walls opened onto a breathtaking view of a city that constantly pulsed with relentless, ruthless ambition. Standing in the center of the sunken living room, you could easily see the flashing, hypnotic neon lights of Times Square, the endless, streaming rivers of yellow traffic crawling up Fifth Avenue, and the dark, glittering expanse of the Hudson River far in the distance. Every single square inch of the enormous space had been meticulously designed by top-tier decorators with one sole purpose: to intimidate and impress. The polished, imported marble floors flawlessly reflected the morning sunlight. Massive, cascading chandeliers imported directly from Italy sparkled brilliantly like captured, frozen stars. An original, museum-quality art worth tens of millions of dollars hung silently and imposingly on the pristine walls. To naive outsiders, this place was the ultimate dream. It was the impenetrable palace of a self-made man who had successfully conquered New York's vicious real estate game. Whenever wealthy guests stepped through the heavy double doors into the Blackwell home, they instinctively lowered their voices and whispered in genuine awe. They eagerly drank vintage champagne from delicate crystal flutes, aggressively posed for social media photographs against the stunning panoramic windows, and eventually left completely convinced that Ambrose Blackwell and his stunning wife Jacqueline were the very living definition of marital and financial perfection. But that perceived perfection was nothing more than a well-crafted mask. And Jacqueline intimately knew the ugly truth of it better than anyone alive. For her, this multi-million-dollar penthouse was simply a cold, beautifully gilded cage. She painfully remembered the very first time she eagerly moved in shortly after their lavish wedding. She had been completely dazzled, just like everyone else. She joyfully ran her fingers along the heavy, custom velvet drapes, laughed out loud at the absolutely absurd, cavernous size of her new walk-in closet, and genuinely thought she had finally safely arrived at the incredible life she had once only dreamed about as a little girl. But as the long years slowly passed, the brilliant sparkle of the home dulled significantly. The persistent, heavy silence of the massive, empty room slowly became mentally suffocating. The grand, custom-made mahogany dining table, meant to comfortably seat 16 guests, was almost always sadly set for only 2. And far more often than not, as Ambrose worked late or played away, Jacqueline sat at the end of that massive table and ate her meals entirely alone. Jacqueline would often sit quietly by the grand window late at night, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly, looking down sadly at the vibrant city below. The world outside the glass was chaotic and beautifully alive, completely filled with millions of people desperately chasing dreams, laughing loudly with friends, and actually living their lives. Yet inside, trapped in her freezing marble palace, she constantly felt like a fading ghost. Every single sound amplified her loneliness, the sharp click of her heels echoing on the polished floors, the low, mechanical hum of the massive central air conditioning unit, the faint, relentless ticking of the priceless Cartier clock sitting on the mantel. Everything constantly reminded her exactly how hollow and empty the massive space truly was. The penthouse was physically divided into different layers, each one perfectly reflecting the different facets of Ambrose's insatiable hunger for power. The expansive lower level was custom designed explicitly for high-end entertaining. It featured a climate-controlled wine cellar fully stocked with impossibly rare vintages, a dark wood library filled entirely with unread first editions bought purely for display, and a plush, private movie theater where he regularly hosted exclusive screenings to impress potential foreign investors. The upper level was supposedly more private, though it offered little true comfort. Their massive master bedroom featured a sprawling, spa-like bathroom, completely dominated by an enormous soaking tub that had been custom carved from a single, massive block of imported Italian stone. Down the hall was the nursery, in progress, carefully and lovingly decorated with soft, soothing creams and pale, gentle blues. Jacqueline had spent weeks carefully choosing the wallpaper herself, selecting a beautiful, whimsical pattern of tiny stars and gentle moons that she deeply hoped would help soothe their baby to sleep at night. But, tellingly, Ambrose had barely even set foot in the room since the renovations began. Instead, his absolute kingdom was his home office, a terrifying, imposing fortress of cold glass and dark steel that entirely dominated one premium corner of the penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling custom bookshelves proudly displayed dozens of crystal industry awards and framed, glossy magazine covers that exclusively featured his own smiling face. A massive, imposing desk, constantly cluttered with highly confidential contracts and aggressive deal memos, faced the grand window so he could literally survey the vast empire he had ruthlessly built. Jacqueline often actively avoided going into that room. It was not just a workspace, it was a literal, terrifying shrine to his massive ego. A constant, sickening reminder of the humble, hungry man she had originally married and the cold, arrogant monster he had eventually become. What truly haunted Jacqueline the most on a daily basis was how this entire opulent setting perfectly reflected her own complete erasure from his life. The entire penthouse possessed absolutely no trace of her own personal touch or warmth. There were absolutely no candid family photographs hanging on the walls. No silly, inexpensive souvenirs saved from their early vacations together. No tangible evidence whatsoever of the genuine life and love they had once actively shared. Even in their shared bedroom, the stark, modern decor was incredibly minimalist and cold, chosen entirely by Ambrose's high-paid designers, not by his wife. Sometimes she sat on the edge of the bed and quietly wondered if he had ever truly, deeply seen her at all, or if she had simply always been utilized as another beautiful, necessary accessory required for his rapid rise to the top. The heavy irony of her life was incredibly bitter to swallow. The entire city outside loudly celebrated Ambrose as a brilliant man of vision, a magnificent builder of dreams and skyscrapers. But inside his very own home, he had essentially built a beautiful, high-security prison for his own wife. Jacqueline constantly tried to remind herself that things were not always this incredibly bleak. There had absolutely been wonderful, warm moments early on in their marriage when loud, genuine laughter happily echoed off these high walls. When their shared, passionate dreams completely filled the large, empty spaces. But those warm moments had slowly faded into nothingness, entirely replaced by endless business dinners, secretive, whispered phone calls taken in the hallway, and agonizing nights when Ambrose simply did not bother to come home at all. That fateful morning, as she bravely slid the heavy divorce papers across the kitchen table, Jacqueline simply could not help but glance around the massive space one more time. The pristine marble counters, the gleaming, untouched, stainless steel appliances, the massive, expensive vase of fresh white lilies that Ambrose had carelessly ordered through his busy assistant, not as a gesture of love for her, but merely for aesthetic appearances in case guests arrived. Everything looked absolutely perfect. In fact, it was far too perfect. A total stranger walking in off the street might easily think they were the absolute happiest, most successful couple in all of Manhattan. But Jacqueline bore the heavy burden of knowing the ugly truth. Her tired mind drifted painfully to the highly publicized gala Ambrose had attended without her the night before. She could picture the decadent scene. Clearly in her head, massive crystal chandeliers, tables heavily trimmed in real gold, powerful men strutting in expensive tuxedos, and beautiful women draped in designer gowns glittering with millions of dollars in borrowed diamonds. That fast-paced, superficial world was his true, natural setting. He belonged not at home sitting quietly with her, but out there, where ruthless ambition and dark temptation seamlessly blurred into one intoxicating drug. She vividly imagined him flashing his trademark smile for the hungry cameras, leaning in and intimately whispering in the ear of the stunning woman hanging on his arm, his mistress, all while the adoring world loudly applauded his ongoing success. The sharp, agonizing contrast between his public adoration and her private misery was almost entirely unbearable. And yet, as she stood there, a profound realization hit Jacqueline like a lightning bolt. The exact same setting that had successfully made her feel so incredibly small and insignificant for years could now easily become her greatest, most lethal weapon. She suddenly understood a fundamental truth that arrogant Ambrose had completely forgotten in his rise to power. Appearances could be violently destroyed just as quickly as they were carefully built. He had successfully built his entire Billion-dollar empire entirely on public perception, on the carefully crafted illusion of being completely invincible, untouchable, and universally adored. But illusions, no matter how grand, were inherently fragile things. All it took was one tiny, precise crack in the glass, one undeniable truth violently exposed to the light, and the entire towering structure could easily shatter into a million pieces. She took a long, deep, fortifying breath, her determined eyes scanning the vast, sprawling skyline through the thick glass window. This brutal city had a notorious way of entirely crushing weak people, but it also possessed a magical way of lifting the strong far higher than they ever thought humanly possible. Jacqueline had finally decided that she was absolutely no longer content to let herself be crushed. She was definitely not leaving this penthouse completely empty-handed, nor was she ever going to leave it looking defeated and broken. She would firmly find her new strength right here, standing in the very place that had once effectively silenced her voice. Because this grand setting, this luxurious, cold, glittering, multi-million-dollar cage, was not just going to be the sad backdrop of her final humiliation. It was about to become the magnificent public stage of her spectacular rebirth. And as Ambrose stood, entirely frozen at the table, his eyes wide as he stared in shock at the divorce papers, he had absolutely no idea that the pristine walls of the very penthouse he so deeply adored were about to bear silent witness to the total, catastrophic unraveling of his entire empire. Ambrose Blackwell was exactly the kind of powerful man that normal people either deeply envied or intensely feared. To the outside world, he was the absolute, walking definition of a brilliant, self-made tycoon. He promoted the myth that he was born with absolutely nothing, rapidly rising to the top through sheer grit, undeniable charm, and a relentless, predatory hunger. He had successfully built a sprawling, highly lucrative real estate empire worth billions of dollars. Long before celebrating his 40th birthday, his name was constantly whispered with deep, fearful reverence in wealthy boardrooms from Wall Street all the way to Hong Kong. To wealthy investors, he was a magnetic, infallible force of nature. To hungry journalists, he was an endless, fascinating story that always sold papers. To greedy mistresses, he was the ultimate temptation, completely wrapped in a cloak of absolute power and wealth. But to Jacqueline, the woman who shared his bed, Ambrose was something else. Entirely, he was a complete illusion. The kind, ambitious man she had once fiercely adored, the man who had successfully wooed her with cheap candlelight dinners and passionately whispered dreams of changing the world, was completely gone. In his place now stood a cold, calculating monster, a man entirely intoxicated by his own massive success, totally convinced he was utterly untouchable, and unbelievably careless with the very foundational relationships that had actually allowed him to climb so high in the first place. He had slowly begun to treat every aspect of his personal life exactly like one of his. Ruthless business deals, coldly calculate the risk, ruthlessly maximize the personal gain, and quickly discard whatever no longer actively served his immediate desires. Tragically, Jacqueline and their beautiful, unborn child had simply become just another annoying liability in his cold, dead eyes. Ambrose absolutely loved the blinding glare of the spotlight. He thrived eagerly on the fawning attention of beautiful, shallow women who saw him not as a complex husband or a future father, but merely as a glittering, golden ticket to a life of unimaginable luxury. Among this eager crowd of sycophants, one particular figure stood out sharply: Cassandra Ward. Cassandra was exactly everything that Jacqueline was not, at least in the incredibly shallow, superficial terms that Ambrose now highly valued. She was 27 years old, possessing flowing raven hair, a stunning body, meticulously sculpted by incredibly expensive personal trainers, and a notoriously sharp, venomous tongue that made her seem daring and exciting in a crowded room. She actively worked in high-end luxury public relations, dedicating her life to orchestrating glamorous, over-the-top galas and exclusive product launches, which initially made her constant presence in Ambrose's orbit seem like a purely convenient business relationship. But actual convenience had absolutely nothing to do with their dynamic. Cassandra expertly knew exactly how to flawlessly flatter him, how to rhythmically stroke his massive ego until he felt like an invincible god among men. And Ambrose, completely blinded by his own overwhelming vanity, stupidly mistook her calculated, cold manipulation for genuine, passionate admiration. 2. High society. Cassandra was generally dismissed as just another pretty, ambitious face temporarily attached to a very powerful, wealthy man. But, entirely behind closed doors, she actually wielded dangerous, terrifying influence over him. She constantly whispered insidious lies into Ambrose's willing ear, telling him that he absolutely deserved far better than a boring, nagging wife who chose to stay home wearing frumpy maternity clothes. She threw her head back and laughed far too loudly at his mediocre jokes, constantly told him he was the absolute smartest, most brilliant man she had ever met, and happily reminded him at every single opportunity that he was still incredibly young, wildly desirable, and totally unstoppable. She was pure, deadly poison cleverly disguised as expensive champagne, bubbly, intoxicating at first sip, but absolutely lethal in the long run. Jacqueline had tragically heard her name whispered in circles long before she ever actually saw her face. Vicious rumors in elite society circles always traveled incredibly fast. Ambrose Blackwell's exciting new protege, they politely called her, though absolutely everyone in the room knew exactly what that title really meant. At lavish galas, people constantly whispered behind their hands, exchanging knowing, pitiful glances toward Jacqueline whenever Ambrose and Cassandra coincidentally disappeared into the hallway at the exact same time. Jacqueline, deeply humiliated but fiercely determined to preserve her own fragile dignity, bravely ignored the cruel whispers for as long as she possibly could. But last night, when Ambrose blatantly stayed out until the dawn broke over the city, the ugly truth became entirely impossible to ignore anymore. The worst part was that Ambrose himself did not even try to hide his affair anymore. That was the absolute cruelest part of it all. He arrogantly strutted through the massive penthouse exactly like nothing was wrong at all. His expensive cologne was heavily tinged with the unmistakable, sickening scent of another woman's floral perfume. He arrogantly told himself that weak, dependent Jacqueline would never actually leave him, fully believing that she desperately needed him, completely depended on his wealth, and simply could not financially or socially survive without him. That blinding, supreme arrogance was going to be the catalyst for his ultimate downfall. The stark, depressing contrast between the two women in his life was painfully obvious. Jacqueline, heavily swollen with the innocent child they had created together, sat waiting entirely alone in a massive, cavernous, silent penthouse, while Ambrose happily lounged in exclusive VIP nightclub booths with Cassandra. Her fake, bubbly laughter constantly ringing in his ears. To Ambrose, his loyal wife Jacqueline had completely become invisible. Her years of massive sacrifices deemed entirely irrelevant. Her deep, abiding love entirely forgotten. He falsely convinced his own conscience that as long as he continued to provide massive amounts of financial wealth, he basically owed her absolutely nothing else in life. Cassandra, on the completely other hand, played her villainous part perfectly. She happily paraded herself directly at his side wearing tight, sequined designer gowns, making sure she was heavily photographed at every major charity event, constantly whispering sweet promises of a wild, glamorous future that a pregnant, tired Jacqueline could simply never compete with. Cassandra was loudly bold where Jacqueline was softly gentle. She was wildly reckless where Jacqueline was thoughtful and careful. She was incredibly shallow where Jacqueline was deeply profound. And Ambrose, completely addicted to the thrilling high of novelty and ego, stupidly mistook her wild recklessness for deep, abiding passion. But the truth was, Cassandra was absolutely not in love with Ambrose Blackwell. She was entirely strategic. She intimately knew all of Ambrose's deepest weaknesses, his massive, fragile ego, his desperate, pathetic need for constant public validation, and his deep, terrifying fear of eventually growing old and becoming entirely irrelevant in the business world. She deliberately fed those exact weaknesses daily, ensuring he stayed tightly hooked on her presence. For her, Ambrose was nothing more than a convenient, wealthy stepping stone. Absolutely not a soulmate. He was merely a man with incredible connections, massive wealth, and immense power, an incredible career opportunity conveniently wrapped up in very expensive Italian suits. She absolutely never planned to stay around to grow old with him. She fully planned to ruthlessly use his resources until his golden shine completely dulled, and then she would quickly and easily move on to the next glittering, wealthy prize. But Ambrose simply could not see it. He firmly believed he was fully in control of the situation, that he was the powerful, wealthy hunter claiming his prize. But in absolute truth, he was the foolish prey. He was pathetically chasing the fleeting illusion of lost youth, entirely blind to the incredible, loyal wife sitting at home, whose quiet, enduring strength completely outshone any cheap mistress's fake charm. In private conversations, Ambrose began to openly speak of Jacqueline with utter, disgusting contempt. "She is just so incredibly dull now," he cruelly confided to a senior colleague late one night over scotch. "Literally all she ever talks about is the baby, the new nursery colors, her boring doctor visits. I need real excitement in my life. I need to actually feel alive." His colleague simply nodded politely, though even he privately knew that Ambrose was foolishly playing with highly dangerous fire. Cassandra always smiled a wicked, triumphant smile whenever she heard him say such cruel words. Every single insult he directed toward Jacqueline firmly cemented her own toxic influence over him. "You absolutely deserve someone who can properly match your high energy," she would purr into his ear. "You need someone who actually understands your demanding, high-profile lifestyle." And Ambrose, entirely blinded by his own massive vanity, completely believed her lies. Yet, even as he rapidly sank deeper and deeper into Cassandra's carefully laid trap, the very foundation beneath his feet began to critically crack. What Ambrose entirely failed to realize was that Jacqueline was absolutely no longer the silent, weak, passive woman he arrogantly imagined her to be. With every single cruel insult, every missed dinner, every unexplained absence, every long, cold night she spent entirely alone in that massive bed, her inner resolve hardened into steel, while he was out foolishly flaunting his cheap mistress to the world, Jacqueline was quietly, methodically preparing her own brilliant, quiet revenge. The primary antagonists of this story, Ambrose and Cassandra, firmly believed they were the ones actively writing the script of their lives. They arrogantly believed Jacqueline was just a pathetic background character destined to quietly fade away into obscurity. But what they both completely failed to understand was that true, lasting power often lies entirely in silence. And when that long silence finally breaks, it does so with the terrifying, unstoppable force of a massive earthquake. Ambrose returned home that fateful morning feeling incredibly smug, totally convinced that the entire world was still resting safely in the palm of his hand. Cassandra had deeply kissed him goodbye at her door, whispering sweet promises of another secret, thrilling rendezvous, another long night of wild, reckless pleasure. He genuinely thought that absolutely nothing could shake his empire. But when he casually walked into his own kitchen and saw Jacqueline sitting there, waiting with a stack of legal divorce papers. His massive confidence severely faltered for the very first time in years. For the first time, Ambrose realized with a jolt of pure terror that he was not the only intelligent player in this game. And he had absolutely no idea that the quiet, gentle woman he had underestimated the most was about to become the very terrifying storm that would quickly bring his entire billion-dollar empire crashing violently down to the ground. The tense morning Jacqueline finally handed Ambrose those divorce papers was actually only the very beginning of the war. Suffering betrayal in the privacy of one's home was incredibly painful, but suffering betrayal in the blinding public eye was utterly, soul-crushingly devastating. And tragically for Jacqueline, that horrific public moment came far faster than she ever expected. Exactly 2 weeks after that fateful, tense breakfast, the Blackwells were socially scheduled to appear at one of Manhattan's most exclusive, glamorous events, the highly anticipated Metropolitan Charity Gala. It was a massive, annual tradition, considered the absolute crown jewel of the city's elite social calendar, where powerful CEOs, corrupt politicians, and A-list celebrities mingled freely under massive, antique chandeliers the exact size of horse-drawn carriages. The Blackwells had been permanently etched on the VIP guest list for years, always reliably arriving arm in arm, projecting the absolute perfect picture of marital elegance and financial power. Jacqueline entirely dreaded the idea of going now, but public appearances still heavily mattered in their world, and Ambrose aggressively insisted they attend. He coldly framed it as a strict business obligation. Our biggest investors will be there tonight, he firmly told her, adjusting his expensive diamond cufflinks in front of the large hallway mirror. We absolutely need to show a united front. Unity sells. His cold voice carried the heavy, unmistakable arrogance of a man who still firmly believed he entirely controlled the public narrative. Jacqueline, still heavily reeling emotionally from his deep betrayal, but fiercely unwilling to give him the immense satisfaction of a cowardly retreat, quietly agreed. She would go, but not as his shiny, obedient accessory. She would attend as his absolute equal. The grand night of the gala arrived, and the massive, historic hall glittered with unimaginable, sickening excess. The dozens of gold-trimmed tables positively overflowed with thousands of rare, imported orchids. Impeccably dressed waiters smoothly carried heavy silver trays of vintage champagne. And a highly acclaimed string quartet played classical music softly beneath a massive, architectural arch of cascading, brilliant crystal. Dozens of aggressive photographers clustered tightly at the red carpet entrance, their blinding flashes rapidly capturing every single high-profile arrival. Jacqueline deliberately wore a stunning, custom gown of deep emerald silk that perfectly hugged her changing figure, her pregnancy now a very soft, undeniable curve beneath the expensive fabric. She had chosen the dress very deliberately. It was a loud, visual reminder to the world that she carried not just the heavy weight of her husband's betrayal, but also the beautiful, pure promise of a brand new life. Ambrose, dressed in his perfectly tailored custom tuxedo, looked every bit the conquering, wealthy tycoon. Playing to the flashing cameras, he smiled broadly, holding Jacqueline's arm tightly, whispering staged, entirely, fake compliments into her ear for the press to capture. For a brief, fleeting moment, Jacqueline naively thought perhaps he actually understood the sheer importance of keeping up proper appearances for one night. But that fragile illusion shattered violently the exact moment they stepped inside the grand ballroom. Cassandra was there. She stood boldly near the lavish, silent auction tables, draped heavily in blinding scarlet sequins. Her bright, red lips curved into a smug, knowing smile that was absolutely anything but innocent. Lively conversations visibly faltered as wealthy people noticed her presence. Cruel, excited whispers instantly rippled through the elite crowd like a physical wave. Absolutely everyone in that room knew exactly who she was. Everyone had eagerly heard the scandalous rumors. But physically seeing her, standing there, as bold as daylight at an event Ambrose was co-hosting with his pregnant wife, was something else entirely. It was a brazen declaration of war. Jacqueline's stomach instantly tightened into painful knots, but she forced herself to hold her head incredibly high. She had already endured more than enough humiliation in the privacy of her own home. Tonight, in front of the entire world, she absolutely would not falter. Ambrose, however, seemed entirely unfazed by the tension. He warmly greeted wealthy acquaintances, laughed far too loudly at bad jokes, and constantly glanced toward Cassandra's direction with the sickening arrogance of a man who firmly thought absolutely no one could touch him. The ultimate, unforgivable betrayal reached its absolute peak during the highly anticipated charity auction itself. Ambrose, standing confidently on the main stage before hundreds of massive donors and critical investors, proudly announced the launch of a massive new commercial real estate project. Cameras flashed wildly. Polite applause filled the cavernous air. And then, completely, without hesitation or shame, he smiled and invited Cassandra directly onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambrose declared loudly into the microphone, his hand resting lightly and intimately on her bare back in front of everyone. Please meet the incredibly brilliant woman who is helping me shape this magnificent new project, Miss Cassandra Ward. Audible gasps actually erupted from the sophisticated crowd. Wealthy investors exchanged highly uneasy, shocked glances. The rumored mistress was no longer just standing in the room. She was literally standing on the main stage, proudly introduced to the world by Ambrose himself. And Jacqueline, heavily pregnant and maintaining her dignity, sat directly in the front row, her pale face brightly illuminated by the exact same stage lights that currently glorified her husband's blatant betrayal. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the moment completely stole her breath away. For years, She had been the loyal one, tirelessly supporting him, entirely behind the scenes, drafting his important speeches, gently soothing his volatile nerves before big meetings, and smiling politely at exhausting events while desperately hiding her profound loneliness. And now, in front of the entirety of Manhattan's elite society, he casually discarded her for another woman as though she were a completely irrelevant piece of trash. She physically felt the hot, stinging burn of public humiliation as hundreds of eyes slowly turned toward her. Some were filled with genuine pity, while others gleamed with cruel, harsh judgment. A wealthy, older society matron sitting nearby whispered far too loudly, "Oh, poor, pathetic Jacqueline." A younger, more vicious woman smirked and whispered, "Well, I guess he finally upgraded." But Jacqueline absolutely refused to crumble under their gaze. She clasped her expensive clutch tighter until her knuckles turned white, lifted her chin slightly higher, and forcefully willed her burning tears to stay back. If Ambrose actually thought this horrific public moment would finally break her spirit, he was entirely wrong. When the deeply uncomfortable presentation finally ended, the polite applause scattered very uncertainly. Cassandra visibly basked in the stolen attention, her hand lingering far too long on Ambrose's tuxedo arm. He grinned broadly, entirely convinced he had just made a massive, bold statement of his ultimate power, but in stark reality, he had merely made a pathetic, massive spectacle of his own disgrace. As the long night slowly unfolded, the cruel whispers only grew louder. "Did you see what he just did? His pregnant wife is sitting right there. How utterly shameless." The very same powerful people Ambrose so desperately sought to impress now looked at him with deep, visible unease. And Jacqueline, entirely silent but incredibly steady, instantly became the tragic, fascinating figure that absolutely everyone in the room could not stop glancing at. There was an undeniable, powerful strength in her deep stillness, a profound dignity in her quiet composure. She was absolutely not the one who should be embarrassed. Tonight, he was. Much later, as tipsy guests freely mingled near the massive champagne fountain, Jacqueline politely excused herself from her table. She walked slowly and gracefully through the parted crowd, the heavy emerald silk of her gown brushing softly against the polished marble floors. Dozens of heads turned to watch her. As she passed, her quiet, dignified presence commanding the room in a profound way that Ambrose's loud money could absolutely never manufacture. She finally reached the heavy exit doors and paused, turning slightly to look back over her shoulder one last time. Across the crowded room, Ambrose accidentally caught her eye, and a brief, sudden flicker of genuine unease quickly crossed his smug, arrogant expression. For the very first time that night, a dark shadow of doubt crept into his mind. Perhaps he finally realized in that exact moment that Jacqueline's complete silence was absolutely not a sign of weak submission. It was a calculated, terrifying strategy. Jacqueline left the stifling gala entirely without a single word, stepping out into the freezing, crisp night air. The massive city buzzed loudly around her, completely indifferent to her intense personal pain. Yet the cold air felt strangely liberating to her lungs. For the very first time in many agonizing months, she actually felt fully in control of her own destiny. The deep betrayal had brutally humiliated her in public. Yes, but paradoxically, it had also completely freed her from her obligations to him. She absolutely no longer had to smile and pretend. The hungry paparazzi cameras waiting outside instantly caught her dramatic exit, pregnant, beautifully poised, and walking entirely alone. She knew that by tomorrow morning, the vicious tabloids would absolutely feast on the juicy scandal. But surprisingly, instead of the pathetic pity Ambrose expected her to receive, Jacqueline would soon find something else entirely. Massive public sympathy, overwhelming support, and a powerful global platform she had never, ever expected to wield. Because sometimes, the very public stage that is cruelly meant to destroy and humiliate a woman actually becomes the exact stage where she discovers her wings and rises. And as Jacqueline quietly disappeared into the dark Manhattan night, Ambrose Blackwell had absolutely no idea that the screaming newspaper headlines eagerly awaiting him the next morning would officially mark the violent beginning of his absolute downfall. When Jacqueline finally stepped into the quiet safety of her chauffeured car, after fleeing the gala, her adrenaline crashed, and her hands shook so violently that she accidentally dropped her expensive clutch onto the dark floorboard. The gorgeous emerald silk of her gown still shimmered beautifully under the passing neon city lights, but deep inside, she felt entirely stripped bare and raw. The immense public humiliation clung tightly to her body like a heavy, suffocating second skin. All those staring people, the cruel, pointing whispers, the blinding, flashing cameras, it all replayed endlessly in her exhausted mind like a cruel, twisted horror film. She simply could not stop the loop. She pressed her shaking palms firmly against her swollen belly, desperately whispering a tearful apology to the innocent life growing inside her. I am so incredibly sorry, little one, she murmured into the dark car. You absolutely do not deserve to be born into this mess. Her loyal driver glanced in the rearview mirror and asked softly if she wanted to go straight home. She immediately shook her head in horror. Home? That sprawling, cold penthouse was absolutely not a home anymore. It was a terrifying prison heavily filled with painful memories of shared laughter that had slowly, sickeningly curdled into toxic lies. Just drive, she whispered exhaustedly. And so they drove aimlessly, endlessly weaving through the bright, sleepless, chaotic city streets while Jacqueline desperately tried to steady her erratic breathing. She finally returned to the dark penthouse near midnight, though every single weary bone in her body loudly screamed against entering it. As soon as she stepped inside the massive foyer. The crushing, heavy silence of the place crashed down upon her shoulders. The giant crystal chandelier hanging above her glimmered mockingly in the dim light, as if deliberately trying to remind her that she was permanently trapped inside a gilded palace of betrayal. She violently tore off her pinching heels. Hörbara footsteps echoing hollow across the cold marble as she stumbled forward and entirely collapsed onto the plush velvet sofa. The dam finally broke, and the tears came then, uncontrollable, burning, and completely raw. For so many agonizing weeks, she had bravely fought to stay composed, desperately trying to hide her immense pain behind polite, fake smiles and perfectly steady words. But now, she simply had nothing left to give. She sobbed violently until her throat burned with pain, desperately clutching a velvet throw pillow to her chest as though it alone could physically hold her shattered body together. Her slender body shook uncontrollably. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, and for the very first time since discovering Ambrose's horrible betrayal, she fully, completely allowed herself to fall apart. It was not just the sheer pain of the public humiliation that broke her. It was absolutely everything. It was the long, wasted years of immense sacrifice, the crippling, daily loneliness, the painful way she had willingly abandoned her own bright dreams just to help build his. It was the millions of moments she had quietly told herself to simply stay silent for the sake of maintaining peace in the house, the hundreds of long nights she had cried herself to sleep entirely, alone while he was out chasing glory and other women. Every single painful memory aggressively rushed back into her mind like a massive, unstoppable flood, entirely drowning her in a sea of grief. Jacqueline thought deeply about her loving parents back upstate, about the strong, unwavering values they had proudly instilled in her from birth. They had raised her to be incredibly strong, to always endure hardship, and to always hold her head up high no matter what. But in this dark, miserable moment, sitting alone in a multi-million-dollar apartment, she felt like she had completely failed them and entirely failed herself. She thought sadly about the ambitious, bright young girl she used to be, the one who fiercely dreamed of making a massive difference in the world. Where exactly had that passionate girl gone? Somewhere along the tragic way, she had slowly buried her true self under heavy layers of marital compromise and constant sacrifice, until absolutely nothing but Ambrose Blackwell's silent, compliant shadow remained. Her phone suddenly buzzed aggressively on the glass coffee table. She glanced at it and saw dozens of rapid notifications from major news outlets and vicious gossip blog. Cruel headlines screamed across the glowing screen in bold letters. Blackwell wife humiliated at gala. Mistress takes center stage. Pregnant wife watches in silence. The end of the Blackwell fairy tale. Jacqueline quickly turned the phone face down, utterly unable to bear reading another single word. Her chest physically ached. Her pulse pounded painfully in her ears, and deep, Dark despair violently clawed at her tight throat. She was more exhausted than she had ever been in her entire life. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, she actually wondered if she possessed the physical and mental strength to go on living this way. She slowly dragged her heavy body down the long hall to the unfinished nursery, a quiet place that had once filled her entire soul with boundless hope. The beautiful, custom wallpaper of tiny, delicate stars and pale moons shimmered faintly in the dark room. She sank heavily into the wooden rocking chair, resting her trembling hands protectively on her belly. The baby suddenly kicked gently, as if deliberately trying to remind her that she was absolutely not in this fight alone. The beautiful, sudden sensation instantly brought fresh, warm tears to her tired eyes. "I just do not know how to do this," she whispered brokenly into the heavy silence. "I do not know if I am actually strong enough." Her dark thoughts rapidly spiraled out of control. What if Ambrose used his massive wealth to take absolutely everything from her? What if she tragically ended up completely penniless, forced to raise a child entirely on her own in a ruthless city that happily chewed up the weak and spat them out? What if the entire world only ever saw her as the pathetic woman who was left behind? The inadequate wife who simply was not pretty or exciting enough to keep her billionaire husband. Pure. Paralyzing fear gripped her heart like an iron vice. She had always considered herself an incredibly resilient person, but this deep, profound betrayal had fundamentally cracked her soul in complex ways she simply did not know how to repair. The following days blurred together into a dark, numb haze. She barely ate enough to sustain herself. She aimlessly wandered the massive penthouse in total silence, constantly haunted by the lingering memories of a deep love that clearly no longer existed. Every single corner of the home agonizingly reminded her of Ambrose. She could almost hear his loud, confident laughter echoing in the glass office. She could still smell his expensive cologne lingering heavily. In the master bedroom, she remembered the exact, gentle way he used to hold her hand as they stood together at the balcony railing. Even the constant, dull sound of the massive city below seemed incredibly cruel to her ears. It was a loud, daily reminder that the rest of the world effortlessly went on while her entire universe had completely crumbled into dust. Friends frantically called her phone. She completely ignored them all. Her mother's best friend even left a tearful voicemail desperately pleading for her to come visit upstate. But Jacqueline simply could not bear the terrifying thought of facing anyone who knew her. She felt entirely too exposed, far too fragile to speak. It felt exactly as if the entire world had eagerly witnessed her massive humiliation and was simply waiting with bated breath to see if she would finally rise or completely collapse under the pressure. One rainy evening, she stood silently by the massive living room window, staring blankly out at the twinkling, indifferent skyline. This very city had once filled her young heart with incredible awe and endless hope. Now, it just mocked her failures. She leaned forward and pressed her hot forehead against the cool glass. Her own sad reflection staring back at her, she looked incredibly pale. Deeply tired. And entirely broken. "Who are you?" she whispered to the glass. She barely recognized the hollow woman staring back at her anymore. Her severe emotional breakdown finally reached its absolute peak. The horrible night she casually discovered online that Ambrose had actually given Cassandra one of her very own necklaces, a priceless sapphire pendant that had been a cherished, sentimental wedding gift from her own parents. She saw the disgusting paparazzi photo on a gossip blog, Cassandra proudly wearing it at another high-profile event, smiling incredibly smugly right beside Ambrose. That specific betrayal cut significantly deeper than any other. Jacqueline screamed, a sound of pure agony, and collapsed entirely onto the hardwood floor, clutching her belly, her painful, racking sobs loudly echoing through the completely empty penthouse. But it was exactly in that terrible moment, lying at her absolute lowest point, on the cold floor, that something profound inside her soul fundamentally shifted. The tears suddenly stopped. She realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that she simply could not keep living like this. She could not keep drowning in her own misery while Ambrose and his mistress happily thrived. She had an innocent life depending entirely on her now. Someone who absolutely deserved far better than a weak, broken mother. Her baby desperately needed her to rise up and fight. Jacqueline angrily wiped her stained cheeks, though her small hands still trembled violently. She was not fully ready yet. She still felt completely shattered into a million pieces. But somewhere deep down in the dark, smoking rubble of her broken heart, a tiny, fierce spark suddenly glowed. Faintly. It was a powerful spark that whispered quietly of raw survival, of hidden strength, and of an incredible coming transformation. And as she sat there in the dark, fiercely clutching her belly, Jacqueline had absolutely no idea that an unexpected, powerful ally was about to officially step into her chaotic life and pour gasoline on that tiny spark, igniting it into a massive, unstoppable fire. The morning after Jacqueline's devastating collapse on the nursery floor, she awoke feeling different. Her eyes were heavily swollen and her body physically ached. But for the very first time in weeks, there was a completely new sensation growing in her chest. It was a strong, undeniable flicker of absolute resolve. She sat up slowly in the massive bed, placed one protective hand on her belly, and whispered out loud to the empty room, "I absolutely will not let him destroy me. I will not let our innocent child inherit this immense pain." Her cell phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand again. Normally, she completely ignored it, but this time, fueled by her new resolve, she actually reached out and answered. The deep, familiar voice on the other end of the line entirely startled her. It was Daniel Whitaker, an old, trusted acquaintance from her university days. Daniel had once been a very shy, highly studious boy who quietly admired her brilliance from afar in their law and economics classes. But time and life had drastically changed him. Now, he was widely known as one of New York City's absolute most brilliant, respected, and feared attorneys, famous for his unshakable, bulldog integrity and his absolute, lethal brilliance in the courtroom. "Jacqueline," he said gently, his voice a soothing balm. "I saw the news. I will not pretend for a second to know all the intimate details of what is happening. But if you ever need someone standing firmly in your corner, someone you can absolutely trust with your life, I am here for you." Her tight throat instantly closed up with emotion. For so many agonizing weeks, she had felt utterly, entirely alone against a billionaire giant. Now, for the very first time, a powerful figure was freely offering her real, tangible support completely without judgment or an ulterior motive. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I do not even know where to begin. It is a nightmare." "Begin exactly with the truth," he replied smoothly and confidently. "Tell me absolutely everything Ambrose has done to you, everything you have endured, behind closed doors. Do not hold a single detail back. I will happily handle all the rest." Jacqueline hesitated for a moment. Years of forced silence and a deep instinct for self-preservation made her naturally cautious of everyone. But something in Daniel's steady tone, something so incredibly kind, yet undeniably certain and strong, finally broke down her massive defensive walls. Over the phone, she poured her heart out. She told him absolutely everything. She described the crippling daily loneliness, the blatant introduction of the mistress, the horrifying public humiliation at the gala, and finally, the absolute final straw, the cherished sapphire necklace stolen from her past and gifted to a homewrecker. By the time she finally finished speaking, her voice shook violently with pure exhaustion. But Daniel's immediate response was incredibly firm and reassuring. "Jacqueline, listen to me very carefully. You are significantly stronger than you think you are. And Ambrose may currently have a lot of money and perceived power, but he is absolutely not untouchable. In fact, you currently hold far more leverage over him than you even realize." She frowned, deeply confused by his statement. "What exactly do you mean?" Daniel hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then significantly lowered his voice, speaking in a conspiratorial tone. "Ambrose's massive real estate empire is not nearly as clean as it looks on paper. I have heard the dark whispers in the legal community. I have personally seen strange legal filings, massive tax loopholes, and highly shady illegal partnerships. If he tries to aggressively push you into a corner with a divorce without absolute fairness, those dark financial secrets could very easily surface. You are absolutely not powerless in this situation, Jacqueline. To a man like him, you are incredibly dangerous." Her heart instantly pounded furiously in her chest. For so incredibly long, she had felt exactly like the weaker party, the pathetic, easily discarded wife. Now, for the very first time, she clearly saw the very real possibility of standing firmly on completely equal ground with the monster who broke her. Over the course of the next tense week, Daniel Whitaker essentially became her absolute anchor in the storm. He visited the penthouse almost daily, helping her meticulously gather critical documents, carefully reviewing obscure, complex contracts that Ambrose had once lazily asked her to quickly sign without offering any real explanation. In her old, dusty personal journals hidden in her closet, she had accurately scribbled detailed notes from overheard phone conversations, highly sensitive things Ambrose had arrogantly let slip late at night when he was drunk and thought she was simply not smart enough to understand or listen. Every single tiny scrap of information, every date, every hidden bank account number suddenly became an incredibly valuable weapon in their growing arsenal. One rainy evening, as they sat closely together in the half-finished nursery, completely surrounded by towering stacks of legal papers, Daniel leaned back in his wooden chair and looked at her. "Jacqueline, do you actually realize what incredible power you hold here? If Ambrose even attempts to try and take everything from you in court, you have the absolute power to completely dismantle his entire public and financial image. You are literally holding the lit match that could easily set his entire fake empire on fire." Jacqueline stared down at the massive pile of damning evidence on the table, her pulse racing wildly. For long years, Ambrose had deliberately made her feel completely stupid and invisible. But being invisible actually had its distinct advantages. While he completely dismissed her presence, she had quietly, brilliantly absorbed critical details, noticed financial patterns, and remembered massive legal mistakes that he arrogantly thought went entirely unnoticed by the world. And now, all of those hidden details could easily become her greatest weapon of mass destruction. The very idea terrified her at first. She was absolutely not a vicious fighter. By her true nature, she was a gentle nurturer, a woman who fundamentally believed in the power of forgiveness and grace. But his brutal, unyielding betrayal had forcefully forged her into something entirely new. She was now a fierce, protective woman who would do absolutely anything necessary to protect her child's future. Daniel seemed to easily sense her internal fear and hesitation. He gently reached across the table, his warm, strong hand comfortingly covering hers. "You absolutely do not have to become a monster like him in order to beat him," he said softly. "You just have to be brave enough to stand fully in the light and tell the truth." His profound words settled deeply into her wounded heart exactly like a sacred promise. He was right. She was not becoming Ambrose. She was finally becoming her true self again. She was the strong, principled woman her parents had raised her to be upstate, the brilliant woman she had foolishly buried beneath years of unnecessary sacrifice. Days quickly turned into long, exhausting nights of intense legal and emotional preparation. Daniel expertly coached her on exactly what to say to the press, how to aggressively hold her ground in a deposition, and how to control her facial expressions. Working seamlessly together, they quietly built an absolute, ironclad case that could not only fully secure her an incredibly lucrative divorce settlement, but could totally and permanently expose Ambrose's sickening financial hypocrisy to the entire world. Through this empowering process, Jacqueline began to physically and mentally change. She began to carry herself entirely differently. Her posture improved. Her shoulders sat straighter, and her beautiful gaze grew significantly sharper and more focused. The pathetic, weeping woman who had completely crumbled on the nursery floor just weeks ago was entirely gone. In her place stood someone, magnificently reborn from the ashes. But the twist in her story was not solely a legal one. Jacqueline soon discovered something else, something deeply, wonderfully personal. Late one night, as they were packing up files, Daniel looked at her and admitted quietly, "Jacqueline, I really want you to know something. I do not just see you as a legal client. I see you exactly as the brilliant, incredible woman I always deeply admired, even back when we were kids in college. You were a bright, shining light back then, and you are an absolute light now, even on the days when you simply do not see it yourself." His sudden, honest confession entirely stunned her. She had been treated as so completely invisible to Ambrose for so terribly long that she had legitimately forgotten what it actually felt like to be genuinely seen and appreciated by a good man. She did not respond immediately. Her battered heart was still entirely too raw to process new love. But something warm and hopeful inside her soul definitely stirred. Perhaps she was not fundamentally unlovable after all. Perhaps she was not the broken, easily discarded wife she deeply feared she had become. Still, Jacqueline practically knew she had to tread very carefully. Her main focus right now absolutely could not be romance. It had to be pure survival. It was about aggressively reclaiming her stolen life, restoring her battered dignity, and securing her unborn child's financial future. Yet, Daniel's constant, unwavering presence gave her immense, quiet strength in beautiful ways she had never expected. He constantly reminded her of the passionate, driven girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of making a massive difference, the one who truly believed she was absolutely worthy of receiving genuine love and basic respect. As the weeks rolled on, the more Ambrose arrogantly flaunted his disgusting affair in the tabloids, the more incredibly determined Jacqueline became to destroy him. She completely stopped crying whenever she saw his name plastered in the headlines next to Cassandra's. Instead of feeling pain, she now saw them for exactly what they truly were: pathetic distractions, cheap smoke, and fragile mirrors. Very soon, the entire world would clearly see the ugly truth. Behind the curtain, One rainy afternoon, Jacqueline stood confidently by the massive glass window of the penthouse, looking out over the sprawling skyline. The massive city no longer mocked her existence. It challenged her to conquer it. She pressed her flat palm firmly against the cold glass and whispered to the city, "I am ready for war." Behind her, Daniel's voice was incredibly steady and supportive. "Then let us begin the show." What absolutely neither of them knew was that Ambrose, like a cornered animal, had already begun to sense the massive shift in the wind, and he was currently preparing a vicious countermove that would severely test Jacqueline's newfound courage more than anything else ever had. The quiet, submissive woman who once hid in silence was forever gone. Slowly but very surely, Jacqueline Blackwell was aggressively shedding the fragile, weak shell Ambrose had cruelly forced her into for years, and something entirely new, something terrifyingly stronger, was finally emerging into the light. The incredible change in her persona began very subtly. She immediately threw out all the shapeless, boring maternity dresses that Ambrose had once cruelly mocked, replacing them entirely with stunning, elegant, tailored gowns that beautifully celebrated her pregnancy instead of shamefully concealing it. She confidently visited an exclusive, high-end salon for the very first time in months, allowing a top stylist to completely restore the soft, vibrant chestnut waves of her hair. When she finally looked in the mirror afterward, she gasped. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Her reflection absolutely no longer showed a pathetic woman broken by her husband's betrayal. It boldly showed a woman magnificently reborn, glowing fiercely with both beautiful vulnerability and a very quiet, dangerous defiance. Daniel absolutely noticed the striking change, too. When he arrived at the penthouse one sunny afternoon, his heavy leather briefcase in hand, he paused in the doorway, visibly struck by the stunning sight of her. "You look incredibly powerful today," he said softly, awe in his voice. Jacqueline smiled a genuine, warm smile, her hand brushing affectionately over her growing belly. "I absolutely have to be powerful now," she replied smoothly. "For both of us." But her incredible transformation was absolutely not just an external, cosmetic one. It was a complete, profound mental rebirth. For weeks on end, Daniel had been expertly guiding her through rigorous, exhausting strategy sessions, essentially teaching her exactly how to control a hostile narrative, how to deflect tricky questions, and how to finally face Ambrose's towering rage, completely without fear. At first, during their practice runs, her voice naturally trembled. But with every single rigorous rehearsal, with each positive affirmation, she grew significantly steadier, sharper, and much fiercer. She practiced her lines in the bathroom mirror every night until she could confidently look directly into her own eyes and say the very words that once terrified her. "I am enough. I am worthy. I will not be destroyed by his sins." The very first major public test of this incredible new strength came at a highly publicized charity luncheon hosted by one of Manhattan's absolute most influential, cutthroat socialites. Jacqueline heavily debated not attending at all, still stinging from the horror of the humiliation at the gala. Her natural instinct was still to hide away and avoid large, judging crowds. But Daniel strongly urged her to go and face them. These people absolutely need to see your face, he said firmly. Not as a hiding, pathetic victim, but as a strong woman standing tall. And so, gathering all her courage, Jacqueline arrived at the crowded luncheon, wearing a breathtaking, tailored sapphire gown, her head held incredibly high. The entire noisy room instantly fell dead silent the moment she entered. Loud conversations paused mid-sentence, hundreds of judgmental eyes turned simultaneously to stare. The cruel whispers began almost immediately. But this time, she absolutely did not shrink away from them. She walked through the massive dining room with incredible grace, her posture absolutely flawless, her sharp gaze completely steady. Some faces in the crowd softened slightly with genuine sympathy, while others hardened bitterly with obvious envy at her beauty. But absolutely all of them watched her every move, entirely riveted by her presence. When she was inevitably approached by a swarm of hungry reporters near the entrance, Jacqueline did not flinch or run away. "Mrs. Blackwell, how are you? Currently handling the scandalous rumors regarding your husband," one aggressive journalist shouted, shoving a microphone toward her. She stopped, smiled faintly, and spoke with a voice so perfectly calm it chilled the room. "I absolutely do not respond to baseless rumors," she said smoothly. "I focus entirely on the truth. And the truth always, eventually, comes to the light." That single, brilliant answer spread through the city like explosive wildfire. Within mere hours, her powerful quote was plastered across major tabloids, news networks, and gossip blogs. For the very first time since her horrific public humiliation, the media narrative violently shifted. Jacqueline was no longer painted as the weak, broken, discarded wife. She was widely praised and painted as a highly dignified, composed, and utterly unshakable force of nature. Ambrose, of course, noticed the shift immediately. That very evening, he stormed violently into the penthouse, his face glowing red with absolute, unhinged fury. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" he demanded, spit flying from his lips. "You are deliberately undermining my public image in front of the damn press." Jacqueline simply stood completely calmly at the marble kitchen counter, gracefully sipping a cup of hot herbal tea. "I did not undermine you, Ambrose," she replied coolly, entirely unfazed by his screaming. "I merely spoke the truth." Her absolute, terrifying calmness completely infuriated him far more than any screaming match ever could. He violently slammed his heavy fist against the Expensive marble countertop, shaking the room. You think you are so incredibly clever right now, don't you? You actually think anyone in this city cares about you without my name and my money backing you? Jacqueline slowly set her teacup down and met his furious glare completely. Without flinching, they absolutely do not care about me because of you, Ambrose. They care because when they look at me, they see real strength, something you have completely forgotten how to have. For the very first time in their entire relationship, Ambrose actually faltered. He finally saw it. He saw the dangerous, bright spark in her eyes, the cold, hard steel in her tone. She was absolutely no longer the quiet, obedient woman he had carelessly discarded. She was something entirely else now. Something vastly more powerful. Something he could simply no longer control or intimidate. Jacqueline's massive transformation quickly extended far beyond attending society events and winning verbal confrontations. She immediately began volunteering heavily again, eagerly reconnecting with her small-town roots. She quietly visited battered women's shelters, generously donating her own personal resources, and sitting for hours listening to horrific stories of survival that closely mirrored her own emotional journey. Each tearful conversation profoundly reminded her that she was absolutely not alone in her pain, that countless brave women had successfully endured brutal betrayal and somehow rebuilt their shattered lives. Their raw strength aggressively fueled hers. Their incredible resilience perfectly mirrored her own ongoing journey. The mainstream press rapidly took major notice of her philanthropic efforts. The newspaper headlines shifted even further in her favor. Jacqueline Blackwell rises from scandal with grace. Betrayed but unbroken. Blackwell wife leads with dignity. A new symbol of strength in New York society. Ambrose absolutely seethed with jealousy and rage. He had spent years and millions of dollars carefully crafting his public image as the invincible, charitable mogul. And now, his own wife, pregnant, publicly betrayed, and radiating pure grace, was completely and effortlessly stealing his beloved spotlight. Cassandra, sensing the shift, urgently urged him to tighten his control over the narrative. You simply cannot let her continue to outshine you. Like this, she hissed venomously into his ear. These people need to be reminded who holds the real power in this city. But Ambrose was slowly, painfully beginning to realize that his precious power was rapidly slipping right through his greedy fingers. No matter how tightly and aggressively he tried to clutch it. Meanwhile, Jacqueline's newfound confidence bloomed brilliantly in highly unexpected ways. She actually began quietly speaking with several major investors whom Ambrose had arrogantly neglected and mistreated over the years. She sat with them, genuinely listening to their deep business frustrations, offering them sincere empathy and sharp insight where Ambrose had only ever offered blind arrogance and demands. Many of these powerful men were absolutely shocked by her deep economic insight, her incredible ability to perfectly recall tiny, critical details from passing conversations from years past. She was Absolutely no longer the quiet, decorative wife fading into the background. She was rapidly becoming a major, influential player in her own right. Daniel watched her brilliant maneuvers with immense, glowing pride. You honestly do not even realize what you are doing. Do you? He said with a smile. One evening as they reviewed massive stacks of financial documents. You are not just surviving this divorce, Jacqueline. You are actively leading. Jacqueline paused, looked at him deeply, her expression highly thoughtful and serious. I absolutely do not want to lead in his corrupt world, she admitted, softly but firmly. I want to build my own. That profound statement officially marked the absolute turning point in her life. Jacqueline immediately began sketching out comprehensive business ideas for creating her very own charitable foundation. It would be a massive organization dedicated specifically to helping women and children navigate the horrors of domestic betrayal, financial abuse, and the difficult process of rebuilding their lives from scratch. It was absolutely not about petty revenge anymore. It was entirely about achieving total transformation. She desperately wanted her immense pain to officially become her greatest purpose. She wanted her deep, ugly scars to become a beacon of strength for others who were suffering in silence. But even as she rapidly rose in power and popularity, she practically knew the massive storm was absolutely not over yet. Ambrose was simply not the type of arrogant man to accept a public defeat quietly, and Cassandra, driven entirely by her ravenous hunger for high status, absolutely would not go down without a vicious, bloody fight. The dangerous battlefield was rapidly shifting, but the ultimate war was far from done. Still, for the very first time in so many long months, Jacqueline truly felt the warm, bright fire of pure possibility burning in her chest. She was absolutely no longer merely reacting to his betrayal like a victim. She was aggressively rewriting the entire script. The weak woman who once crumbled and cried in total silence was entirely gone. In her place proudly stood a fierce mother, a brilliant fighter, and a profound survivor who had finally, beautifully, discovered her own unshakable voice. And as Jacqueline carefully prepared to step fully into her magnificent new role, she had absolutely no idea that her absolute greatest chance for ultimate revenge and her greatest, most terrifying test of strength would soon come to pass on the very same public stage that Ambrose had once cruelly used to humiliate her. The ultimate night of absolute reckoning arrived in the exact same manner that massive humiliation had originally come to Jacqueline, directly under the blinding glow of crystal chandeliers, situated right in front of hundreds of flashing press cameras, with the entirety of Manhattan high society eagerly watching her every move. It was the night of the annual Blackwell Foundation Gala. This was an incredibly massive, exclusive event that Ambrose himself had arrogantly created years earlier, entirely designed to solidify his fake public image as a caring, generous philanthropist. Ironically, this very same event would soon become the exact public stage that completely and utterly undid him. Jacqueline had heavily debated for days whether she was truly, mentally ready for this moment. Could she realistically stand there and face him? Could she face the wicked Cassandra? Could she successfully face the exact same elite crowd that had once looked at her with such sickening, pathetic pity? But as she stood quietly before her massive bedroom mirror that evening, gently smoothing the luxurious fabric of her stunning, custom ivory silk gown, she realized a profound truth. She was absolutely not walking into this massive battle for herself alone anymore. She was proudly walking in there for every single woman on earth who had ever been cruelly silenced, casually discarded, or deeply humiliated by a powerful man. She was fighting for her unborn child, and she was fighting for her own bright future. Daniel quietly met her in the grand lobby of her building, his usually serious expression instantly softening into awe when he saw her descending the stairs. "You are absolutely radiant," he said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. She gave him a small, highly confident smile, slowly steadying her breathing. "Tonight," she whispered fiercely, "I finally stopped being his shadow." The massive gala venue pulsed with sickening, overwhelming extravagance. The beautiful sounds of playing violins swelled toward the vaulted ceilings. Rivers of expensive vintage champagne flowed freely into crystal glasses. Millions of dollars worth of borrowed diamonds glittered brilliantly beneath the massive chandeliers. Ambrose was already there, holding court in the center of the room. Cassandra stood tightly at his side, draped heavily in a scandalous gown of blood-red silk. They arrogantly posed for the photographers, flashing huge, fake smiles exactly as if they completely owned the night and the city. Ambrose's massive, blinding arrogance was entirely unshaken. He firmly believed the media narrative was still entirely his to manipulate and control. But the exact moment Jacqueline elegantly entered the grand hall, the entire energy of the massive room violently shifted. Loud conversations instantly faltered into dead silence. Hundreds of heavy cameras rapidly swung entirely toward her direction, and a profound, heavy silence fell over the elite crowd. Like a massive tidal wave, she glided into the room, incredibly radiant and perfectly poised, one hand resting protectively and proudly on her pregnant belly. Loud, audible gasps filled the cavernous hall. This was absolutely no broken, weeping wife. This was a powerful woman entirely transformed into a goddess of vengeance. Ambrose's smug, practiced smile instantly froze on his face. Cassandra's heavily painted lips curled into a nasty smirk, but her wide, panicked eyes entirely betrayed her deep, sudden unease. Jacqueline did not even bother to acknowledge their pathetic existence. She walked straight past them both, effortlessly, commanding the absolute attention of the entire crowd using her sheer grace. Alone, Daniel gently guided her directly toward the main stage, where she was officially scheduled on the program to give a brief, ceremonial speech. It was a speech that Ambrose had arrogantly assumed would be entirely routine. boring, and highly complimentary to his ego. But he was entirely wrong. Jacqueline had completely rewritten every single word of it. When she confidently took the wooden podium, the massive audience physically leaned forward in their seats, completely captivated. Her voice, amplified by the microphone, was incredibly clear, fiercely strong, and carried beautifully across the glittering room. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Tonight, we all safely gather here for the Blackwell Foundation Gala, a beautiful tradition supposedly meant to honor human compassion, basic dignity, and absolute truth. But tonight, I absolutely will not deliver the boring, scripted speech my husband foolishly expected me to give. Tonight, I will finally speak my own truth." A massive, electric ripple of shock moved rapidly through the wealthy audience. Ambrose shifted violently in his front row seat, his jaw tightening so hard his teeth audibly ground together. Cassandra's sharp acrylic nails dug painfully into his tuxedo arm. Jacqueline paused, letting the silence build, and then continued. "Many of you in this room only know me simply as Ambrose Blackwell's quiet wife. For many long years, I admit, that was my only chosen role. I spent my life standing silently at his side, smiling obediently for your photographs, hosting your lavish dinners, and quietly raising our home, but entirely behind the blinding glitter, behind the beautifully polished marble walls of our multi-million dollar penthouse, there was always another, much darker story unfolding. It is a terrible story of deep betrayal, of profound, daily humiliation, and of massive, unseen sacrifice." Loud gasps loudly echoed through the hall. The press cameras flashed at an incredibly frantic, blinding pace. Ambrose violently shot to his feet, his face purple with rage, hissing loudly, "Jacqueline, that is enough. Stop this immediately." But she did not flinch. She slowly raised her hand, her piercing eyes locking directly onto his panicked face with a terrifying, absolute calm that effectively silenced him far more than shouting ever could. She slowly turned her attention back to the captivated audience. "I was deeply betrayed, not just as a loyal wife, but as a brilliant woman who willingly gave up her own massive dreams to help build someone else's empire. I was betrayed in private for years, and finally, I was brutally betrayed in public. You all saw it happen. You all whispered cruelly behind your hands. And I was forced to carry the crushing weight of that terrible silence entirely. Alone. The massive hall was now so incredibly quiet that the giant chandeliers actually seemed to hum in the air. Jacqueline's voice steadied even further, ringing out like a crystal bell. "But silence is absolutely no longer my choice. I will absolutely not be invisible anymore. I will not be casually discarded like trash. And I absolutely will not allow my innocent child to inherit a legacy of shame instead of a legacy of dignity. At that exact, calculated moment, she gestured smoothly toward Daniel, who confidently stepped out from the shadows and handed her a thick, heavy legal folder. She deliberately opened it for all to see, holding up the massive stacks of irrefutable evidence they had spent weeks meticulously gathering, signed documents, secret contracts, hidden financial records. For entirely too long, this massive empire has been built on a foundation of lies and illusion. But illusions eventually crack, and tonight, I choose the absolute truth. Suddenly, the massive digital screens directly behind her brilliantly lit up with high-definition projections. The crowd gasped in horror as they saw the evidence displayed in 50-foot letters: illegal, highly unethical contracts, clearly showing Ambrose's massive corporate fraud, highly damning, time-stamped. Images of Cassandra proudly flaunting stolen family jewelry, detailed financial timelines that perfectly aligned his supposedly crucial business trips with massive embezzlement and fraudulent offshore accounts. The elite crowd gasped, significantly louder with every single new slide that appeared. Powerful investors muttered angrily to one another in shock. Hungry journalists scribbled frantically in their notepads. Thousands of cameras clicked furiously, documenting the exact moment a billionaire fell. Ambrose, completely losing his mind, lunged forward toward the stage. "This is absolute slander," he shouted frantically, his voice cracking with pure panic. "None of this means anything. She is lying." But Jacqueline's powerful voice completely cut through his pathetic screaming. "It means absolutely everything, Ambrose, because the entire world finally deserves to know the real monster hiding behind the mask. And I finally deserve to thoroughly reclaim my stolen voice." The entire audience suddenly erupted. But it was absolutely not with the pathetic pity they had shown her weeks ago. They erupted with massive, deafening applause. Dozens of women in expensive gowns rose to their feet, clapping furiously, nodding in deep agreement, with warm tears of vindication streaming from their eyes. The powerful men who had once deeply envied Ambrose's wealth now whispered furiously among themselves, quickly pulling out their phones to sell their stock, realizing with horror that the arrogant emperor truly had no clothes. Ambrose stood completely frozen in the center of the aisle, his face ashen and pale, heavy beads of cold sweat forming rapidly at his temples. Cassandra desperately tried to pull him back away from the glaring lights, but the aggressive photographers instantly swarmed them both like sharks smelling blood, their massive lenses rapidly capturing every single humiliating crack in his once flawless composure. The massive, billion-dollar empire he had spent decades ruthlessly constructing was visibly unraveling. Thet bitini thet, completely crushed under the immense, undeniable weight of his wife's absolute truth. Jacqueline gracefully stepped down from the wooden podium, the deafening applause still echoing loudly against the vaulted ceilings. Daniel gently took her hand, supporting her and steadying her as she walked proudly right past Ambrose. She paused directly in front of him for one final moment. Her beautiful eyes were completely steady, her voice incredibly low, but as firm as steel. "You truly thought I was incredibly weak. You arrogantly thought I would just quietly disappear into the night. But you completely forgot one thing, Ambrose. Brilliant women like me absolutely do not vanish. We rise." And with that final, devastating blow, she turned and walked away, completely, leaving him standing there in the smoking ruins of his life before the entire judging city. But even as the massive applause thundered in her ears, Jacqueline practically knew the ultimate war was not completely over. Exposing him publicly was only the explosive beginning. The real, difficult battle, the exhausting legal fight for her child's safe future, her total financial independence, and the ultimate healing of her own battered soul was still waiting ahead. And somewhere hiding in the dark shadows of the gala, the wicked Cassandra was undoubtedly already desperately plotting her next vicious move. A move that could potentially put absolutely everything Jacqueline had worked to build at massive risk. The immediate, explosive aftermath of the gala spread through the world like an uncontrollable wildfire. By the very next dawn, every major newspaper across the entire country blazed with massive front-page headlines. Blackwell Empire shaken to its core by wife's shocking revelation. Jacqueline Blackwell exposes husband's massive fraud and betrayal in front of elite. From humiliation to heroine, the incredible rise of Jacqueline. For Ambrose Blackwell, it was the absolute, undeniable beginning of the end of his life. Terrified, wealthy investors aggressively pulled hundreds of millions of dollars out of his company within mere days. Corporate stocks heavily tied to his massive companies plummeted to absolute zero. High-ranking government officials immediately announced massive federal investigations into his highly illegal business practices, heavily spurred by the very damning evidence Jacqueline had so bravely revealed on stage. Cassandra, quickly realizing her glittering golden ticket to wealth was rapidly crumbling into dust, completely vanished from his side almost overnight. The very same greedy woman who had once passionately whispered endless promises of eternal devotion now entirely refused to even answer his desperate phone calls. Ambrose violently raged. He viciously threatened everyone around him. He pathetically begged for help, but absolutely none of it mattered anymore. The towering, shiny empire he had built on extreme arrogance, lies, and illusion was rapidly collapsing, brick by heavy brick. For the very first time in his entire adult life, Ambrose Blackwell was completely and utterly powerless. And Jacqueline? She was finally, wonderfully free. The subsequent, highly publicized divorce proceedings, entirely guided by Daniel's brilliant, steady legal hand, ended incredibly swiftly and highly decisively. Ambrose desperately tried to fight her in court, but the massive mountain of irrefutable evidence stacked heavily against him left him completely cornered and legally destroyed, Jacqueline successfully secured complete financial independence, gaining full ownership of the massive penthouse, heavily lucrative settlements, and most importantly, absolute sole custody of her unborn child. She had not only survived his assassination of her character, she had entirely triumphed over his evil. But Jacqueline's massive victory was absolutely not defined by the money or the luxurious property. It was entirely defined by her restored dignity. For the very first time in long years, she walked freely through the polished marble halls of her massive home without feeling exactly like a trapped prisoner. The giant space that once cruelly mocked her existence now felt entirely like it belonged to her. The silence in the rooms was absolutely no longer suffocating. It was beautifully, incredibly peaceful. As the quiet weeks rapidly passed, Jacqueline enthusiastically poured all of her newfound energy and massive financial resources into finally building the charitable foundation she had once passionately dreamed of creating. The Rising Light Foundation officially opened its grand doors in the heart of the city, freely offering massive resources, top-tier legal counseling, and safe, beautiful shelter to brave women facing extreme domestic betrayal, financial abandonment, and physical abuse. She frequently spoke at massive charity events. Absolutely not as Ambrose's silent wife, but as Jacqueline Blackwell, a brilliant woman who had successfully endured hell, fought back fiercely, and magnificently risen from the ashes. Her incredible story resonated globally. Thousands of letters poured into her office daily from suffering women all across the country. Some women tearfully wrote of their own devastating heartbreaks. Others simply wrote to deeply thank her for bravely reminding them that they were absolutely not alone in their suffering. Each and every letter profoundly strengthened her resolve, entirely proving to her that her immense past pain had absolutely not been wasted. One bright, beautiful spring afternoon, Jacqueline stood proudly on a small wooden stage at the foundation's massive opening ceremony. She wore a stunning, simple white dress, her baby bump now completely round and incredibly proud. The large room was entirely filled with loving supporters, brave survivors, and respectful journalists. Daniel stood quietly at the very back of the room, watching her intently, his kind gaze completely filled with overwhelming, genuine pride. Jacqueline's clear voice was perfectly steady as she spoke to the crowd. When my entire world violently fell apart, I honestly thought my life was completely finished. I truly thought the profound betrayal had entirely destroyed me. But I was entirely wrong. It absolutely did not destroy me. It finally revealed me. And I desperately want every single woman sitting in this room today, every woman who has ever been cruelly told by a man that she is simply not enough, to hear my voice clearly. You are absolutely not defined by someone else's horrific betrayal. You are entirely defined by your own incredible strength, your massive resilience, and your daily, powerful choice to Rise up and fight back. Deafening, joyous applause instantly filled the massive room. Warm, happy tears shimmered brightly in the eyes of complete strangers. And Jacqueline knew, with absolute certainty in that exact moment, that she had finally found her true, magnificent purpose in this life. Exactly 2 months later, she successfully gave birth to a beautiful, incredibly healthy baby boy. She proudly named him Gabriel, specifically after her hard-working grandfather, a profoundly good man who had lovingly taught her the absolute value of true honor and quiet courage. Holding tiny Gabriel closely in her tired arms, she felt a massive, profound peace she had long forgotten actually existed. His tiny, warm fingers curled tightly around hers, forever, anchoring her to a bright future entirely filled with massive hope. Daniel was right there waiting at the hospital, sitting patiently in the quiet hallway with a massive bouquet of beautiful flowers. He absolutely did not push her romantically. He did not selfishly demand her time. He simply stood loyally by her side, a quiet, unwavering constant in the chaotic storm of life. Over time, their beautiful bond slowly and naturally deepened, not as some cheap fairy tale romance, but as something incredibly real, incredibly steady, and firmly built on absolute, unshakable mutual trust. He absolutely never tried to selfishly replace what she had lost. Instead, he constantly helped her beautiful soul rediscover exactly what she had always truly deserved from a man. Ambrose, meanwhile, completely faded into obscurity from the daily headlines. His entire corporate empire rapidly crumbled under the massive weight of endless federal lawsuits and criminal investigations. The incredibly arrogant man who had once truly believed himself to be a god among men was quickly reduced to nothing more than pathetic, dark whispers of societal pity. Jacqueline absolutely never spoke a single ill word of him publicly. She simply did not need to. His massive, epic downfall was entirely of his own ignorant doing. Her absolute silence toward him was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate, powerful symbol of her complete closure. Many years later, when young Gabriel was finally old enough to quietly ask questions about his absent father, Jacqueline answered him with profound honesty, but entirely without toxic bitterness. Your father made many massive, terrible mistakes in his life, she said softly, holding her son's hand. But those dark mistakes absolutely do not define who you are. You are entirely your own person, Gabriel, and you will always grow up completely surrounded by deep love, absolutely not by lies. The incredible, magnificent transformation of Jacqueline Blackwell slowly became so much more than just a passing news story. It became a massive, cultural symbol. It became a powerful symbol proving that brutal betrayal absolutely does not end a strong woman's life, that choosing silence does not ever equate to possessing weakness, and that total, beautiful dignity can always be powerfully reclaimed. even after suffering the most horrific public humiliation imaginable. And as she stood beautifully one warm evening on her massive penthouse balcony, the vibrant, glittering skyline of the city spread out magnificently before her, and Gabriel safely and peacefully asleep inside the nursery, she finally allowed herself a genuine, massive smile. The very same massive city that had once cruelly mocked her existence now felt exactly like a warm, supportive companion, pulsing loudly with the exact same massive resilience she had finally discovered. Hiding deep inside herself, she whispered softly into the warm night air, making a sacred promise for her growing child, for her healing self, and for every single brave woman who was still struggling silently in the dark shadows of the world. I am absolutely not broken. I am absolutely not forgotten. I am completely free. And with that profound, beautiful realization, Jacqueline Blackwell stepped entirely and joyfully into her incredible new life. She was no longer living as a pathetic victim of deep betrayal, and she was absolutely no longer hiding as the invisible shadow of a powerful, corrupt man. She was finally, and forever, the absolute, magnificent heroine of her very own story. All right, my wonderful, amazing friends. So, this incredible, emotional story has finally come to an end. You're all still right here with me, aren't you? If you actually stayed with me all the way to this exact moment, then I know that something very deep in Jacqueline's powerful journey must have truly touched your heart, too. Maybe it is the beautiful, profound reminder that absolutely no matter how incredibly deep and painful the betrayal is, true healing is always possible. The great Stoics used to say, we suffer more in imagination than we ever do in reality, and Jacqueline magnificently proved that exact philosophy by bravely rising completely above her horrific humiliation and actively choosing immense strength over dark despair. Her terrible fall absolutely did not define who she was. Her incredible, magnificent rise did. And that, my friends, is the ultimate, beautiful lesson for all of us today. Your deepest pain can always become your greatest, most unstoppable power, and your darkest scars can truly become the guiding map to someone else's ultimate survival. If this powerful story deeply resonated with your soul today, please do me a massive favor. Absolutely smash that like button on this video. Share this incredible story with someone in your life who really needs to hear a message of hope today. And please, do not forget to hit that subscribe button to join our amazing community. Together, let us keep reminding each other every single day that we are absolutely never fundamentally broken. We are only ever beautifully becoming exactly who we were always meant to be. See you in the next video.